In the depths of an ancient, mist-shrouded forest, where no sunlight could ever pierce through the dense canopy of twisted branches, a forgotten tale from ages past began to unfold. The trees, with their gnarled and intertwined limbs, formed a barrier so thick that it felt as if the very sky was being kept at bay, hidden forever from prying eyes. The ground beneath, covered in a thick layer of decayed leaves, crunched softly underfoot with every step. Yet, the rustling of leaves was not the only sound in this eerie place. A cold wind howled through the trees, carrying with it the mournful wails of unseen spirits, as if the forest itself was alive with the whispers of those long dead. Amidst the shadows and swirling fog, a lone traveler made his way through the treacherous woods. Clad in a long, black cloak that billowed like a shadow behind him, he moved with an otherworldly grace. The faint light of a lantern in his hand cast fleeting glimpses of his path, yet his face remained hidden beneath a wide-brimmed hat, obscuring his features entirely. This mysterious figure was known as Andralus, one of the last surviving members of an ancient order of sorcerers, whose very existence had faded into legend. Andralus was on a journey to an unknown destination, drawn by forces he could not ignore. Deep within this cursed forest, rumors spoke of a dark and abandoned fortress, once home to the most powerful and malevolent sorcerers the world had ever known. This fortress was said to guard a secret so dangerous that even the bravest of wizards dared not seek it out. With every step that brought Andralus closer to the fortress, the air grew heavier, more oppressive. The fog thickened, and the eerie wails of the wind grew louder, more despairing. But Andralus walked on, undeterred, for he knew this was the only path left to him. As he ventured deeper into the forest, unseen eyes began to watch his every move. These eyes, glowing with an unnatural light, belonged to creatures of the night, beings known as the Shadow Watchers. These creatures, born of darkness and fear, were the guardians of the ancient secret hidden within the fortress. Commanded by the spirits of the long-dead sorcerers who once dwelled there, they prowled the woods, ever vigilant for those who would dare to intrude. Andralus drew nearer to the fortress, and as he raised his lantern, he caught sight of the Shadow Watchers emerging from the trees. Their bodies were as black as the night, their eyes glowing like tiny embers in the darkness. With razor-sharp claws, they crawled toward him, their movements silent and deadly. But Andralus stood his ground, unafraid. He whispered incantations under his breath, and suddenly, the light from his lantern flared to life, shining with a brilliance that cut through the fog like a blade. The Shadow Watchers recoiled from the light, hissing in pain, before retreating back into the shadows. This was only the beginning of Andralus's journey. He knew that the forest and the fortress that lay within it were filled with dangers and dark secrets that could consume anyone who dared to seek them out. But he had no choice but to press on, for his destiny was tied to this place, and only within the heart of this darkness could he find the answers he sought. Andralus reached the gates of the fortress. The massive, iron doors creaked open with a groan, releasing a musty scent of decay and death. Inside, the fortress was eerily silent, as if it held its breath, waiting. Andralus raised his lantern and stepped into the grand hall, lined with towering columns that seemed to stretch on into the shadows. The walls were adorned with ancient tapestries depicting sorcerers of old, each with eyes that gleamed with madness and power. Andralus, after passing through the long and terrifying corridor, finally arrived at a vast and grand hall. The faint light from his lantern barely managed to pierce the overwhelming darkness of the space. The hall was immense, with high ceilings lost in the shadows, supported by towering columns carved with ancient symbols and figures that seemed to move in the flickering light. At the far end of the hall, a massive throne, carved from obsidian and adorned with silver runes, loomed ominously. It was empty, yet it exuded a powerful aura, as if it had not been vacant for long. The air was thick with an eerie silence, broken only by the occasional creak of the fortress settling and the distant, echoing whispers of unseen forces. As Andralus moved cautiously forward, his eyes were drawn to the walls, which were lined with enormous tapestries. These ancient weavings depicted scenes of battles between sorcerers, creatures of the night, and mysterious beings whose forms were obscured by shadow and fog. Each tapestry seemed to tell a part of a story of power, betrayal, and dark magic. The faces of the sorcerers in the tapestries were twisted with madness and rage, their eyes gleaming as if they were alive and watching Andralus's every move. Suddenly, a soft breeze stirred within the hall, and with it came the faint sound of a woman's voice, singing an old, haunting melody. The voice was distant yet clear, echoing through the vastness of the hall and sending shivers down Andralus's spine. He paused, listening intently, trying to determine where the voice was coming from. But the hall was vast, and the sound seemed to come from all directions at once. Compelled by an unseen force, Andralus moved closer to the throne. As he approached, the light from his lantern revealed something unexpected: an ancient book, lying open on the throne's seat. The book was massive, with pages that looked as though they had been untouched for centuries. The writing on the pages was in a language Andralus did not recognize, and the ink seemed to shimmer as though it was still fresh. With a mix of caution and curiosity, Andralus reached out and touched the edge of the book. The moment his fingers brushed the aged parchment, the entire hall seemed to tremble, and the air grew colder. The whispers grew louder, filling the room with unintelligible words, and the voice of the woman intensified, now pleading, begging for something unknown. Andralus knew that whatever lay within the pages of this book was powerful, perhaps too powerful. But he also knew that it held the key to the mysteries of this fortress and the fate that awaited him. Taking a deep breath, he began to read, his eyes scanning the cryptic text, as the world around him seemed to hold its breath, waiting for what would come next. As Andralus continued to decipher the cryptic text within the ancient book, a sudden rush of cold air swept through the grand hall, extinguishing his lantern. The darkness swallowed the room whole, leaving only the faint glow of the book's pages to illuminate his surroundings. The air grew heavy with the scent of old, forgotten magic, and the distant whispers that had haunted him earlier now seemed to come from right beside him. A deep, resonant voice echoed through the hall, its source unseen. It spoke in the same ancient language that was written in the book, its tone commanding and filled with a power that made the very walls tremble. Andralus, though filled with a growing sense of dread, could not tear his eyes away from the glowing text. He felt as if the book itself was pulling him deeper into its mysteries, compelling him to understand the words that danced across the pages. As he read on, the voice grew louder, clearer, until the words began to make sense in his mind. The book told of a powerful entity, an ancient sorcerer who had once ruled over the very land on which the fortress now stood. This sorcerer, known only as the Shadow King, had delved into forbidden magics, seeking to control the forces of life and death themselves. His ambition had led to a catastrophic war, one that had torn the very fabric of reality, releasing unspeakable horrors into the world. In the final pages, Andralus found a prophecy, a warning written in blood-red ink. It spoke of a time when the Shadow King would rise again, his power restored by one who dared to read the words of the cursed book. The prophecy foretold that this individual, if not strong enough to resist the Shadow King's influence, would become his vessel, bringing doom upon the world once more. A chill ran down Andralus's spine as the realization hit him. The book had not simply been left there by chance. It had been waiting for him. The fortress, the whispers, the eerie voice. It was all part of the Shadow King's plan. Andralus had unknowingly begun the process of the Dark Sorcerer's resurrection. Before he could react, the ground beneath him began to shake violently. The columns lining the hall cracked, and pieces of the ceiling crumbled to the floor. The voice of the Shadow King, now full of malice and dark intent, laughed cruelly, reverberating through the hall as the fortress seemed to come alive around Andralus. The ancient sorcerer's spirit was awakening, and Andralus knew he had little time. If he didn't act quickly, he would lose himself to the Shadow King's power. With a determined look, Andralus closed the book with a loud thud, cutting off the voice mid-sentence. Silence fell upon the hall, but the tremors continued, the walls groaning under the strain of the dark magic that had been unleashed. Andralus knew what he had to do. He needed to find the source of the Shadow King's power within the fortress and destroy it before it was too late. But as he turned to leave the hall, the heavy doors at the far end slammed shut with a deafening bang. The fortress wasn't going to let him escape easily.